It is wonderful to see you all on this beautiful October afternoon. Thank you so much. I know you could be many places, and we do really appreciate that you're here with us. My name is Brandon Terry. I am obliged by my paycheck to say that I'm the John Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences here at Harvard University. I'm also the Joy Foundation Fellow on sabbatical at Radcliffe Institute. And one of the only people that could get me to come outside during sabbatical is Aziz Rana. So I am just delighted to be here and to organize this event with my co-organizer, Sanjay Jolly, the executive director of the program on law and political economy here at Harvard Law School. We're also thankful to our co-sponsors at the Center for American Political Studies and the faculty director of CAPS, Ryan Enos. I should also say that I am co-sponsoring this event in my official capacity as co-director of the Institute on Policing, Incarceration, and Public Safety at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research here at Harvard. None of this would be possible without the support of those institutions or without the organizational vision and acumen of Kate Davies, the program assistant at the program on law and political economy, and my dear friend and colleague, Elizabeth Ross, who is a tremendous legal scholar and historian and is our lead research fellow at the Institute on Policing, Incarceration, and Public Safety. Her dissertation is really phenomenal, and you guys are all gonna love it when it comes out. We're gonna do another one of these. So enormous thanks go out to them and all the people who helped put this together, from tech support to food provision and to the good people at facilities. We convene today at a moment of extraordinary anxiety and deep social conflict in American civilization. We are now just 10 days away from an election that on many accounts raises profound worries about the adequacy of our political culture and constitutional order in securing the future of democracy and even civil peace. One candidate promises to launch the largest mass arrests and deportations in American history, and defends himself from allegations of fascist commitments levied by his own former chief of staff, claiming criminal immunity on the basis of a Supreme Court whose legitimacy has plummeted in the wake of scandal and political machination. In response, the other candidate has appealed to the venerable Constitution, but by recruiting, if only for electoral expediency, the architects of America's forever wars and their curtailment of civil liberty to somehow signal this fidelity to democracy and the rule of law. A stubborn group of voters, not simply apathetic, but disillusioned and disgusted, are conspicuously frustrated by the choices on offer and the seeming impossibility of the transformational changes that could meet the challenges of authoritarianism, war, racial domination, and economic injustice. Seemingly deadlocked in a battle for a tiny sliver of votes in a country riven by partisan distrust and hostility, the kinds of victory that seem on offer promise more recrimination than reconciliation. If the last election occasioned an open rebellion against the results in the form of a deadly riot at the Capitol building, and the prospect that a mob might indeed lynch sitting members of the American government, this go-round raises fear that if the results defy the popular vote, the constitutional commitments to the Electoral College, the power of the Supreme Court, and the unaccountable influence of billionaires that make such results possible may be simply too intolerable to concede. We find ourselves, many of us, disoriented by the collapse of our expectations of this government, disempowered by the education in American civics we received, presumably in good faith. We confront hard existential challenges about, as Martin Luther King asked, where do we go from here? In such an atmosphere, it's an extraordinary gift and opportunity to receive a book like Aziz Rana's The Constitutional Bind, How Americans Came to Idolize a Document That Fails Them. Aziz is a generational scholar, one whose ability to combine critical political theory, constitutional law, social theory, political economy, comparative politics, and the intellectual history of elites and insurgents alike promises to upend conventional wisdom across several fields. Sam Moyn is not wrong to describe the book as one that divides the age that came before it from the era that its appearance opens. There will be things in the book for everyone to disagree with, but it strikes me as the sort of text that will make it hard to proceed in the style, substance, and manner of argument as before. This is because the constitutional bind is nothing short of a radical intervention into how we understand American constitutionalism, democracy, and political freedom. In a nation that holds its constitution in near religious reverence, Aziz attempts to unmask this veneration, to reveal the paradoxes that stifle democratic life. On the one hand, the Constitution is celebrated as a living symbol of democratic achievement. But on the other, it's become an obstacle to the kind of expansive democratic powers required to address our nation's deepening crises of inequality, racism, foreign war, and political disenfranchisement. What Aziz powerfully argues is that this contradiction is no accident. It is built into the very structure of American constitutionalism itself. Our symposium today brings together an extraordinary group of scholars, journalists, and public intellectuals to engage with the core arguments of the constitutional bind. This group reflects the breadth of Aziz's arguments and his interventions, because too often, constitutional politics are relegated to narrow legal frameworks guided by an elite cadre of judges, lawyers, and technocrats who interpret the Constitution in ways that reinforce existing power structures and repeat the conventional terms of debate. What the constitutional bind calls for, and what we hope our symposium achieves, is a democratization of constitutional politics, an unflinching examination of how constitutional principles and cultural conceptions of the Constitution have historically served to both promote and limit democratic aspirations. And even more importantly, how we normatively and politically might respond in the present. The first panel this afternoon, The Problem of Constitutional Veneration, will feature Kedrick Roy, E.T. Stone, and Robert Tsai. The second panel, Forging Alternative Constitutional Horizons, will feature Zora Ahmed, Barrett Holmes Pittner, and David Posen. The day will conclude with a keynote discussion of the book and the arguments brought up throughout the day between Aziz and Osita Wanavu, the award-winning journalist. Now, often when I look at my bank account or my mortgage payments, I wonder, why didn't I go to law school? But the answer is not really financial. It's in part because I didn't see my questions or imaginative aspirations well reflected in the legal scholarship that I knew of as an undergraduate. It didn't seem to be the site for my politics, nor did it seem to be the site for conversation with those interlocutors whose thought was so central to my own formation. I hope that this book changes that for the people that come after it. I think it makes it impossible for scholars of law and politics to avoid the political theory of the Constitution, not just its jurisprudence. And in one fell swoop, dramatically expands the canon of constitutional thought to include figures as far-flung as W.E.B. Du Bois and Harry Haywood, to Norman Thomas and Emma Goldman, to Grace and James Lee Boggs. There will be debates about specific interpretations or judgments about the significance of the constitutional critiques of the Socialist Party or the Black Panthers. But that these figures are even ushered into these debates with sensitivity and sophistication, not just hagiography, makes possible a new conversation for students of law and politics. It recovers, for those of us who are desperately looking for a way forward out of this morass, a tradition of activism and inquiry that can sharpen the emancipatory possibilities of political judgment here and now. As we face authoritarianism, intractable war and civilian slaughter, economic inequality, and the backsliding of democracy, Aziz's call to radically reimagine constitutional politics could not be more urgent. Our hope is that this symposium rises to his challenge. And here to say a bit more about his book and start us off this afternoon, Aziz Rana.
Do I need to stand behind here for the microphone, or can I just?
I think so it can pick up on the.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Well, so first, I just want to say thank you to Sanjay, to Brandon for organizing today, for that incredibly generous introduction. Thank you to Elizabeth for all of her work with the organizing and everybody else that was involved in putting today together, as well as all of the folks that agreed to participate on the panels. I know the book is a long book and it takes a lot of time and effort to sort of interrupt the ordinary procession of your work and lives to come and be here, and all of you for attending. I'm genuinely, really deeply touched by the fact that today is taking place and everybody's commitment to having this conversation together. And so what I thought I would do, maybe for, I guess, about 20 minutes, so it might be that we go a little past one in this session, is rather than give a talk that outlines all of the elements of the book, just work through what the stakes of the book project were to me, where the book came from, and what I view as some of its key scholarly and political interventions. And in a sense, the book is a product, I think, ultimately of this moment that Brandon so powerfully articulated, which is we're living during a time in which the American constitutional project more generally, with the actual institutions of the state at the heart, but as an ideological formation that makes sense of what it is to be an American, feels like it's unraveling. And it's unraveling from events in Gaza and Lebanon all the way to our own conversations here at home about our electoral process and the future of our institutions in the wake of an upcoming, what seems existential debate between the center and, frankly, the far right. And in a way, what I wanted the book to do was to make sense of what the broader American project has been, how it was consolidated, and what does it mean that it feels like it's unraveling at this moment, and what tools do we have intellectually, politically, to think beyond the terms of what, in my view, have been a fairly limited set of intellectual and political resources that have been granted to us from the official stories. And the book itself was a product of two different types of questions that I was struggling with, let's say, over the last 10 years. The first had to do with making sense of the arguments of my first book, The Two Faces of American Freedom, within both the academic literature, but then also just as a citizen here in the US. And then the second had to do with the experience of being situated in an American law school and teaching constitutional law every fall to first-year students. So let me think about how those two are connected. So my first book's basic argument was that we can't understand most of American legal and political development without appreciating the extent to which the country should be understood as what I called an experiment in settler empire. What I meant by that was that Anglo colonists brought from Europe a really rich account of internal freedom connected to economic independence and political participation. But in the context of North America, they wedded it ideologically and institutionally to practices of exclusion and subordination. So access to land is the condition for independence, and then control over coerced labor is the condition for free work and then political participation. And so freedom for insiders was tied to a project of native expropriation and enslaved black labor. So this is the two faces of American freedom, and that much of American history is a story of struggling with this interconnection and thinking about those moments of political possibility when you could imagine something like genuinely equal and effective freedom for all. I finished that book during like the high tide of the Obama administration, that first term. And it was really telling the extent to which talking about the US in settler terms, or talking about the US as having this quality of both liberation and subordination bound together in a way that we can think of using the language of David Scott as tragic, felt wildly out of step with the times. And that it was also just the case that even if this felt to me like a fairly sort of social scientifically useful way of understanding institutional development, it didn't connect to how people just culturally made sense of their own country. If anything, the national identity presumed that the US was the rejection of European structures of imperialism and colonialism. It was, in fact, the first anti-imperial break. And so I wanted to work through how is it that ideas that actually shape the institutions of American life with a longue durée and a framework, even if anachronistic, wouldn't have been how Teddy Roosevelt would have described the country in 1900, but would have actually made sense as an explanation of American institutions to the folks like Teddy Roosevelt, had reached a point in time when it was wildly out of step with how Americans conceive of themselves, how American scholars study the country. At the same time, over those years, so this is now like 2010 to 2015-16, I was teaching con law, and I was struck by the nature of the class. The class itself was built around an incredibly insulated conversation that was taking place between judges who were not just any kind of legal actor, but really legal actors that had deeply imbibed a story of American exceptionalism and that had a very circumscribed account of what could even be considered a politics of reform. And then the lawyers that are working in concert with those judges over a narrow range of essentially technical interpretations of text. And so this was the conversation that takes place in con law. This is the nature of both the pedagogy and the material that's presented. And it felt, with each passing year, fundamentally out of step with what it just meant to live in this country and what students, in the way that Brandon was describing, were bringing to the classroom. Conversations from outside of the room where you're talking about race, but it's not the particularities of affirmative action and quote unquote reverse discrimination, but it's the fact that the country is experiencing sustained protest over the foundational realities of structural and persistent forms of racial hierarchy. Or there are conversations about the nature of American power, about American democratic and political practice, none of which have a place within the terms of the classroom. And eventually, it became initially, this is something that I was struggling to reconcile, but over time it became clear to me that these two questions were actually linked, that in some deep sense they were one and the same. That the story of how Americans over time came to reconceive the meaning of their national identity was wrapped up with a story of how the Constitution became more than just a set of institutional practices, but closely wedded to an account of national identity, to what in the book I call the creedal Constitution as the justificatory framework for both American civic nationalism as well as American global power. And it meant that the central, let's say, historical argument of the book was to say, we can't understand that transformation in national identity or the rise of constitutional veneration without connecting the Constitution to another development that's almost never discussed alongside the story of internal constitutional practices and processes, which is the fact that over these same years during the 20th century, the US goes from being a regional settler polity in the Americas to a globally dominant and hegemonic superpower. And that these two different developments, the rise of the Constitution as an ideological force in collective life tied to a very specific story of national belonging, and the rise of the US to global superpower status then shape the terms both of American practice overseas as well as the conditions by which you can have any reform conversation domestically, internally. So what I'd like to do now, I guess, for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, is just like work through, once I had this in mind, that I wanted to tell the story of the Constitution in the 20th century through the story of the relationship between the domestic and the foreign, what I saw as at stake, both for the historical argument, let's say for the historical argument, for the scholarly intervention when it comes to constitutional law as a field, and then for like the politics of what I viewed as the relevant takeaways. So on the historical argument, what I was interested in was not just constitutional support in some kind of absolutely open-ended sense. The country has gone through various periods of ebb, flow, rise, fall when it comes to constitutional support. I was instead interested in this idea of a creedal constitution that I've already referenced, drawn from folks like Gunnar Myrdal's account of the American Creed, but going all the way back to anti-slavery and abolitionist arguments that you can get from somebody like Frederick Douglass. And what I was interested in was how a set of concepts became central to the justificatory framework, the legitimation of American institutional practices in a particular period of time by the early to mid 20th century. And to give an idea of what I meant by creedal constitutionalism, it's useful to just list out some of its components. It's the idea that the Constitution stands for the principles of the Declaration of Independence, equality and freedom of all, going all the way back to the founding. That's tied to a defense of civil liberties that's viewed as the opposite of the totalitarian projects of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, that civil liberties are themselves joined to property rights, to economic liberty, because that's also supposed to be a private sphere free of various types of intervention. All of that is tied to a theory of representative government that's deeply constrained. It's marked by checks and balances, and that it has at its apex a Supreme Court that is insulated from public decision-making, that protects the country from tyrannical majorities by ensuring various kinds of rights protections, and that this system is what makes the US exceptional. It's what makes American institutions, despite sort of the reality of the present, understood as a near ideal variation of liberal democracy, and that justifies, therefore, the US playing a special role on the global stage, the US as the first among equals internationally. And so it connects to a story of American primacy, the fact that the US has a right to step inside and outside of various types of legal constraints. All of these elements need not go together. You can believe in the creed and reject the Constitution. You can believe in both, be suspicious of a story of market capitalism that undergirds the idea of economic liberty. You can be committed even to market capitalism, but be wary of the role of the court. And you can commit to all of those elements, but then reject the story of American primacy. But by the time you get basically to the post-war period in the US, and when somebody like Obama or McCain deify or venerate the Constitution, they're taking this uneasy ideological mix and combining it into a single coherent story of national identity. And that's the thing that the Constitution and constitutional support is doing in my account. It's a mix of ideology and institutional form that sets the template for political practice. And that's a thing that only really consolidates against the backdrop of global decolonization in the 20th century. So this is the need for an international perspective. That in the first half of the 20th century, 2 world wars destroyed the old imperial system. For the US to assert power on the global stage, it can't do so by simply replicating the forms of authority, forms of self-justification that had marked the old imperial order, and that an account of the Constitution as wedded to these old anti-slavery ideas, but tied also to the institutional form of American power, to market capitalism, to restrained representative government, and to justifications for power overseas. This becomes the language of arguing that American authority is wedded to principles of constitutional democracy rather than to an account of extractive imperial power. And it's an account that makes sense of a specific moment in time, which is rising non-white political assertiveness, a global system that's increasingly predicated on the equal sovereignty of all, and that it shapes ultimately not just the institutional and comparative arrangements that emerge elsewhere, but also how national elites come to think of the country. They come to think of the country in genuinely anti-imperial terms. And this also then shapes the terms of reform politics, of the traditional elements of the civil rights movement within the US. It felt to me like it was essential to show the links between the foreign and the domestic when talking about not just the American constitutional project, but the political project writ large, because of the extent to which so much of constitutional study is predicated on a normative nationalism that sees the terms of the border as what defines the relevant range of conversation. And this seemed to me an especially troubling move in a context in which the nature of American power at the present is to extend various forms of imperial authority. And so to tell stories of national projects that are within the domestic border not only is problematic for most countries, is especially troubling in thinking about the reach and implications of American political life. It tied then to two kinds of scholarly interventions that I wanted to make. The first had to do with the study of the Constitution specifically. It's striking to me that if we were having a conversation about constitutional meaning 100 years ago, the primary scholars that would be our interlocutors would be historians, political scientists, folks outside of the law school, people like Charles Beard and others, for a very obvious reason, which is there would be a basic understanding that a constitution is not owned by lawyers. It's not just about what happens in a court between judges and interpreters of text. That's just one slice of a constitutional system. Instead, you'd have to understand the Constitution as a whole, the social forces that exist within society, how those social forces connect to a whole range of institutional forms, and the back and forth is between the society and the institutions of which court actions are only one piece. The story really of con law as a field that is owned by the legal academy is a story of the second half of the 20th century. The class is not even required in most law schools until the 20s and 30s against the backdrop of the New Deal. And again, the mode of study in law schools, which is a case method built on conversations between judges and lawyers over text, would have been viewed as out of step with how you'd want to understand a constitution. Yet by the time you get to the second half of the 20th century, with the consolidation during the Cold War period of a broader account of national identity, and also a convergence, a limiting convergence on the types of reform conversations to state and economy that are permissible, both when it comes to domestic practice, but also the international system, then it makes sense that to study the Constitution is just to study what the court does, and to have a conversation intergenerationally with judges over the limited terms of what they view as ameliorative reforms. And part of what I wanted to do was to provide effectively a critical history of the field that I found myself embedded in, to understand why I was placed in a classroom, understood as a constitutional expert, to teach a course that by necessity seemed to move off the table the vast range of issues that the students came into the class wanting to explore and know about. And it led to a second key intervention of the book, which is I wanted, therefore, both for my field, my specific field professionally, but also as a kind of contribution to the public conversation, let's say, to dramatically expand who gets to count as a constitutional actor. If we'd reached a point in American collective life where the conversations that had taken place between presidents and judges had left us bereft of the tools to address rolling social crises over the last 20 years, from national security crises in the wake of forever wars to the domestic issues of the financial crisis to, again, mass protest over racial injustice and persistent forms of hierarchy, then it struck me that simply imagining that the same cast of characters could provide us with broader solutions both to how the constitutional system should be organized as well as what to do with this American project was a necessarily failed effort. And that instead, there is a whole range of figures going back a century plus from within Black, socialist, immigrant, feminist, indigenous, and third world politics globally and transnationally, that had a whole host of ideas about how to reimagine state and economy, so the institutions of collective life, as well as how to think about the persistent ideas that could shape the terms of American membership, how American identity need not be bound to the most sort of limited and official version of the creedal constitutional story that had become the drinking water of collective experience. And it meant taking figures that are never thought of as constitutional actors, some canonical in other fields like Du Bois, and saying, you know, Du Bois wrote 2 books, not 1, but 2 books on the US Constitution, Black Reconstruction and Color and Democracy, that completely decenter our analysis for how we should conceive of constitutional change and constitutional politics. For him, one of the central ways of contesting both empire and white supremacy was going at the unit of the state, which had become the significant representational unit in the entire American constitutional system. And if you take apart that unit and imagine other types of administrative forms that could unleash democratic power, how could that then be tied to various social bases that could serve as intermediate institutions between individuals and government and economic actors, and so expand forms of bargaining power and political authority? So that's Du Bois, but then there's a whole range of figures that have been written out of the American story entirely because of the Cold War limiting of what counts as even an American argument, from Crystal Eastman to W.E.B. Du Bois, to frankly figures like the Kenyan independence leader Oginga Odinga, who had an extended conversation with Thurgood Marshall over the translatability of American ideas of constitutional politics to post-colonial settings, and by extension back to the US in terms of thinking broadly about decolonization. The key set piece, in a way, of this discussion is in chapter 14 of the book, which is my account of the Black Panthers Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in 1970, and maybe that's something that we can discuss. And all of that led, and here's where I'll end, to what I viewed as sort of 2 key political takeaways. There is a conversation right now about the fragility of American electoral and legal institutions, about American democracy. Much of that conversation that promotes a number of reforms that I would agree with, reforms to the court, elimination of the Electoral College, all of the things that would be familiar from just reading the New York Times, strikes me as valuable, but nonetheless wedded to its own version of nostalgia. A hope that either through constitutional change, or barring that, through just holding on to the Constitution as it is, one can somehow go back in time to the period, let's say the mid-20th century, that 30s to the 60s, in which the official story of the creedal Constitution and of American constitutional nationalism and identity could just wrap the political public. But the terms that led to that consolidation were contingent. They were tied to the particularities of the domestic working class and the labor movement that gave teeth and strength to the New Deal. They were tied to the politics of decolonization in the Cold War that led elites on the center-right and the center-left to converge around a set of reforms that we can think of as both the New Deal Compact and a kind of imperial compact. And there's, in a deep sense, no going back. And to me, what that means is that the struggle of the present, if we're going to locate constitutional discourse as part of that struggle, is not to attempt to reconstitute some combination of social democracy and American empire, American power, American exceptionalism, but to think about the potential of doing for the first time what has always been, in my view, the promise and the struggle of the American project, which is, can you combine some rich form of freedom for all with a genuinely anti-imperial politics? And that means not conceiving of the constitutional reform discussion as just about recovering certain kinds of democratic institutions of state that truly have never been real effectively in the US, but instead pushing beyond it in 2 ways. Thinking of constitutional change as not about lawyerly expertise and technocratic fixes, but about power building, about creating the material conditions in society for social groups through policy changes to have the institutional basis at work, in neighborhoods, in housing, in schools, to actually contest the prevailing terms of society. And that might mean alterations in the here and now to elements of the constitutional system. It might mean focusing on other kinds of reforms that can ultimately link up to more transformative changes in the future. It entails two final thoughts. One is that the conditions, in my view, for genuine constitutional change, and you see this in other parts of the world, are conditions in which there's legitimacy within a transformative, multiracial, oftentimes class-based coalition that is a majority for actually rethinking the terms of state and economy. And in opening up a discussion about the Constitution, rather than viewing it as just an exercise in how to recover a kind of institutional form of procedural democracy that seems to be slipping through the cracks, like how can the conversation about the Constitution be a way to actually expand more broadly a discussion about what the American project was, who it served, who it failed, and how institutional reforms can generate new modes of politics. And that means in the final analysis, and this is where I'll end, that the only way, in my view, to have this kind of a conversation is to contest, in a sense, not just a constitution as an institutional arrangement, but the brand of nationalism that gets sort of returned to every time there's a perceived threat. So we see this in Kamala Harris's DNC speech, which is a version of American nationalism that retreats into a defense of national security and exceptionalism, and that cannot and refuses effectively to think about institutional change as part of kind of global processes of transformation that are not exclusively about reinscribing who the insiders are, coming up with new accounts of who the outsiders might be, and then retelling stories of innocence and redemption in ways that are really not up to the task of either the political moment or the global position that the US finds itself in. I'll stop there. Thank you.